Welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast, where today we are going to talk about Brian Cranley's book, The Call of Wonder. So, for those people who listen regularly, you'll know that one of our most recent episodes was with the author Brian Cranley, speaking about his book. The Call of Wonder is really about reconciling science and religion, but also about providing what I called sort of the philosophical breadcrumb trail for the atheists out there, the agnostics out there, those modern men, and there are many of you and women who are reluctant to accept religious revelation of any kind. Listen, this is the age of science, and we should have some empirical evidence to believe anything that we choose to believe. And if we don't, it's going to fall under the umbrella of superstition or, hokum, as I like to say, something like that. So Brian makes a great effort to provide these philosophical breadcrumb trails from ancient Greek philosophy all the way up through kind of medieval scholastic theology. And the idea is, hey, these are the pieces of evidence that do not come from religious revelation. They do not come from anything you might call superstitious. They come from the things that scientists most value: human reason, debate, experimentation, logic, that sort of thing. And so what he's done is he says, look, there's a whole bunch of things that people like Plato and Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and others have brought to the table that give secular people a reason to consider that there might be something, there might be a component of our reality that isn't physical. There might be some truth in the way that religious people and mystical people talk about spirit and things of that nature. And so we can really follow Brian's trail here of breadcrumbs, like Hansel and Gretel, leading our way through logic and reason to a confrontation with God, or the idea that God is a necessary thing, and so we can't write it off like we tend to do in the modern age. So I want to kind of lay out what Brian brought to the table here in the book. So let's do that. I'm going to call this episode The Philosophic Image of God, because this is an idea that Brian plays with, and we'll kind of get to it at the end, but the idea that what we uncover about the quote-unquote image of God from Scripture, we see reflections of in reality. We see reflections of not only in reality, but in our most sophisticated understanding of cosmology and biology and things like that. So, we do have to kind of tiptoe into the pool of analogy and metaphor and allegory to do that. But that's what we're going to do. Okay, so I guess I'll call this first section The Path of Awe. Maybe that's just a play on the title of the book, The Call of Wonder. But I do think that awe or wonder is a path rather than a call. So when I say path, I mean it's leading you somewhere. So we've talked about this before, but this idea of wonder or awe, maybe they're synonyms. We all experience a common experience. We all have experienced moments of awe and wonder before. Maybe it's some kind of an epiphany or a eureka moment. Maybe it's, standing in the presence of some beautiful scene of nature. I remember the first time I visited Tennessee, and I drove through southern Kentucky into Tennessee, and I saw the Smoky Mountains just open up before me. It was quite surprising. In Jellicoe, Tennessee, if you've never been there, you should drive there. One of the most incredible things I've ever seen, and the feeling that you get from it is it's like an involuntary moment of pause. You just sort of frozen looking at it. You may experience piloerection. You may experience the hair on your arm standing up, which is something that happens to me a lot. And people like Jordan Peterson have talked about what the biological roots of awe are. Even the piloerection that we experience when we have a moment like that. Jordan explains that this is exactly the same physiological thing that happens to a cat when it, curls up and it all of its hair stands on end. And what's happening to the cat when it reacts that way? Usually it's finding itself in the presence of a predator. Maybe it's a big dog or something. And so that's the reaction. It is a fight or flight reaction. And that momentary freezing and not knowing what to do, and confronting awe, that's the it's the thing Jordan compares it to is Greek mythology when the hero, what is it, Jason or something, looks at Medusa, and Medusa turns you into stone. So when you see the monster, when you encounter the thing greater than you, the monster whose presence puts your life at risk and puts you in this situation where you don't know, you can't predict what's going to happen next, then you freeze. You're in that moment of analysis. Do I fight or do I run? Now, this is strangely enough, this is the same thing that happens to us when we encounter awe. So when you look up at the night sky and you see the full moon glowing in all its glory, and the stars out there, and you know that they're infinitely far away and they represent worlds and universes beyond which you can never imagine, and you're just swept away with something greater than you. Okay, this is the same thing that happens to the cat in the presence of the predator. Okay, it's being confronted by a reality greater than you. And the reason I say this is a path is because clearly once you've encountered something greater than you and you've been impacted by that so deeply, you realize that there must be things greater than you. You opened your mind to the possibility of things greater than you. Maybe there's more greater than me in reality than this spectacular view of the night sky. Maybe there's some other things. Why does the hair stand up on my arms when I experience some emotional idea or experience? There's all sorts of interesting things that we can explore there. But the idea here is that we've encountered something greater than our own, and our eyes are open to the possibilities of what else might be greater than us, what else might be invisible to us that we haven't stopped to experience or observe, or that we just haven't encountered yet. And there's all kinds of things, that we talk about, like things like the unconscious, which open up a whole vista of those sorts of things beyond us that we don't understand yet are part of our day-to-day reality. Many scientists talk about the quantum world that way. So there's some interesting overlap between spiritual ideas and scientific ideas. And for Brian, it begins with wonder. And I have to imagine if any of my words right now are ringing true to you, if you had an experience like that of your own, which I'm sure all of you have, that you understand something of what I'm saying. So I'm going to just begin, I guess, by giving you some of the things Brian said about the sources of wonder in his own life. So from the book, he says, authentic wonder is the experience that comes when we make ourselves present to bigger realities. Okay? When we stop to consider realities beyond ourselves. The human condition is sort of a self-centered condition. We're the star of the show, we're the center of our universe, and so it's not always easy for us to stop and consider that there's a bigger reality than ourselves. After all, our conscious experience is the whole cosmos as far as we're concerned. But if we can pull back from that and see that we're a part of something bigger even than that, okay, we open up the vistas. And Brian at some point is reflecting on going on a trip where he was climbing what's called the Keyhole Route in the Rocky Mountains. I'm not familiar with it. I'm not a mountain climber, but apparently a difficult climb. And this is what he said about the experience. He said, just standing in the strength of its presence made me feel small and humbled. The mountain commanded our respect without having to do anything at all, simply by being immovably present. The experience was one of real wonder. The hair stands up on my arms, right? So maybe you've had an experience like that. Maybe you know what he means a bit. But he says something else along the same lines, and this is not something that he experienced like, being in the presence of the Rocky Mountains and having that, powerful experience. Instead, this next one is about him doing a mundane thing. He's watching a YouTube video like many of us do every day. And this YouTube video was called What Happened Before the Big Bang. And so it's all this speculative cosmology about the Big Bang and maybe the moment just before, what that might mean. And Brian says, we are familiar today with mass, energy, and the forces that govern physics. But in the very beginning, this familiarity was likely not so. The universe's very first moment, the unity of things was so great, even the four forces of physics may have all been one. No differentiation, a perfect unity. And he says, wonder hit me like a brick in the face. Okay, so whether it's him staring at this, majestic vista in the Rockies, or whether it's him being confronted with this idea just beyond his comprehension, this idea of the singularity, and that moment before the Big Bang when everything is one, and he realized watching this video that means that all of the laws of physics were one in the beginning. We've got all these forces. We talk about the gravity and the small and the weak force and the strong force and all these different forces in physics. But in the beginning, there was no distinction. There was no differentiation. Everything was one, including all of the laws of physics. What does that mean? I don't know what it means. I don't think Brian knows what it means. But the idea that it means something and what it might mean might be tremendously important. And just the idea of that, just letting that sort of simmer, it was a moment of sheer wonder for him, a moment of awe. Okay, he says, I felt wonder for a long time while learning about natural biology and deep space. It wasn't until I heard God described by the ancients in logical terms that I also began to experience wonder in the world of faith. He says, many of us, and this is kind of the gist of the book, the message of the book, so pay attention. He says, many of us end up believing faith and science are incompatible and feel forced to choose between one or the other. What ancient wisdom shows us, however, is quite the opposite. Plato and Aristotle approached the divine from a scientific mindset, using observation, logic, complex reasoning, and debate. They arrived at the need for a necessary existence to explain the world around them. All right, so this is the problem he's trying to solve here. That the zeitgeist nowadays is you're either a religious person or a scientific person. There is no gray, there's no middle ground. It's either one or the other. And he's saying, well, the ancients didn't think that at all. The ancients explored nature. They explored their experience. They debated, they thought about it, they did experiments, they made observations. They thought about it deeply, more deeply than many people do even today. And what they came to is the idea that there must exist something. There's something that is necessary, that must exist, on which everything else is based, from which everything else comes. There must be a first something, a necessary existence. Okay, now that may not seem like much to you, but it's a very metaphysical idea. What is this existence? Why is it necessary? And what form does it take? Is it made of substance? Like what are we talking about here? Well, there's all sorts of questions, isn't there? But what we can't argue is that it is still a necessary something. What might that something be? And that, you see, is the path that leads you to the answer. Okay, and it may lead you into a more mystical answer than you anticipate. If you follow only reason, logic, observation, you may find yourself in mystical territory after all. And that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call philosophical breadcrumbs. And really, he begins in ancient Greek philosophy, and he begins sort of after the pre-Socratics when things ramp up with the great Plato. And I'll just read you some pieces here on Plato, and we'll kind of move through it chronologically. All right, so when he introduces Plato, he's talking about this idea that Plato has of the world of forms or essences or ideas. And it relates to this idea of greater realities that we're talking about when we're talking about awe and wonder. To Plato, there are greater realities, these forms that are out there. They're ubiquitous, right? They're everywhere. Everything is possessed of a form. If it wasn't, then it wouldn't be knowable to you. It would have no form and no way for you to comprehend what it is. A plate is a plate, a dog is a dog, a star is a star because it has the form of such. But you can't put your hands on the form, it's something elusive. And so Plato is talking about greater realities than our own personal experience, let's say, that are ubiquitous and at the same time elusive. They're everywhere, and at the same time you can't grab a hold of them. And I just want to point out, because we do this every time we talk about mystical ideas and ontology, that there's a paradox here. To Plato, the forms are everywhere and nowhere. And that paradox is, as you guys know, a telltale sign of the Ouroboros, of this symbol that represents that singularity we were just talking about, that represents the beginning of things, that represents the necessary existent. And we will start to call that thing God. If you haven't already figured that out, that's where we're going. So this idea, this loosely understood, sort of barely conscious idea that Plato has of God, is in the form of a paradox, something that is ubiquitous and elusive, something that is everywhere and nowhere, this idea of forms. And what's interesting, though, is that reality itself depends on them. But they don't seem to be materially real, these forms. There's something more like ideas, right? There's all sorts of ways that you might act courageously. So there must be something common in all these acts of courage, something that we call courage, or Plato might call the form of courage. So it's having expressions in all these different ways. You save the child from drowning. You save the lady's cats from the apartment fire. You express bravery in all these different ways. They're not the same type of bravery. But we know that they're still brave and courageous. There's a form of brave, there's a form of courageous, that is a pattern upon which all these individual things are based. I can look at the act and say, that's a courageous act. I can point to it, I can hold it. But if you ask me, what is the form of courage? What do I do with that? Right? I'm looking for something that's real and yet not real. I'm looking for a paradox. All right, so let me begin. He says, our journey into the image of God by way of human reason begins with Plato. Okay, and again, I think that is a good summation as well of what he's attempting to do here. He's attempting to discover the image of God, or what we can know about God if God exists, strictly by human reason. Not by a holy book, not by a revelation, strictly by way of human reason. He said that journey begins with Plato. Now, I would probably push back a little bit and suggest that the pre-Socratics that came before Plato were deep into this same path or project. But in any case, the great Alfred North Whitehead said all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato, so fair enough, let's push on. He says, Plato, who claims there exists an unseen, immaterial world of ideal things, forms or ideas. The forms are the most real things of all. However, they are non-physical and therefore inaccessible to our senses. It is through our reason alone that we gain access to this higher world of forms. So what I want you to see here is Plato has an emphasis here on reason that connects forms, this idea of forms, to mind, right? Because what is reason but a faculty of mind? So to Plato, form is attached to mind. And that's going to become important as we go along, because even something like a mind, like consciousness, like thought, that is also immaterial, isn't it? It's not something that science can study exactly. And we know that because consciousness studies is stalled out in every single avenue possible. And neuroscience, and psychology, and it's stalled out. We don't know what mind is. We don't know what consciousness is. We're no closer to knowing, So there's something ethereal and non-material about mind, just as he's suggesting there is about forms. Okay. So there cannot be a dog if there isn't a form, a pattern of a dog that actual dog can actualize. This is the idea. So where's the form? I can see the damn dog on the floor by the fire, but where's the form of the dog? It's something that exists in potential. And what does that mean, right? It's weird. In potential. You might call that the divine realm, or the realm of forms, as Plato would do. You might call that the spirit realm. You might call that the quantum realm. You can point to any sort of name for a non-physical component of our reality. Yeah, fair enough. That's where it is. What does that mean? So you have this idea of a non-physical component to our reality that we cannot deny. And Plato's the first one to point this out. Brian goes on, he says, one of Plato's major contributions begins with the teaching that there can exist non-physical things. Now, most people would agree that virtues like courage and humility exist, though they are immeasurable apart from human action. The realities of mathematics and physics are easier invisible concepts to grasp. Philosophers and scientists have observed that we did not create the laws of physics, we discovered them. This infers they have a non-physical existence somewhere out there and not in our minds. Okay, and I find this interesting. A realm out there which is not physical, but upon which the physical depends. To me, this sounds like a pre-formation of a religious idea of this divine or spiritual component of our reality. I mean, how different is it from this ancient Greek notion of Olympus or Hades, this idea of Plato's world of forms? How different is it? A realm that's non-physical, that physical things don't have access to, and yet is powerful and potent and affects the physical world, and upon which the physical world is dependent. Now, I find a very, very interesting fine line here between this traditional ancient Greek idea of a spirit realm, of a world of the dead or the gods that has the same function in reality that Plato's forms are describing. So there is a much smaller leap from ancient Greek religion to this kind of ancient Greek philosophy, this something more like science than you might think. Now, Brian didn't point that out in the book, but I think it's worth pointing out. All right, he goes on, he says, for Plato, reality has a hierarchy of being. Forms are actually the things themselves, and below the forms comes the physical world. As we ascend the hierarchy of being, we also move from the many to the few. So you can imagine this pyramid shape, right? He says the top level of forms contains a second hierarchy. The lower forms comprise the ideal versions of physical objects, like the form of the dog that we talked about, the form of the chair. The higher forms are those of values and virtues. At the very top of the pyramid, we find the one most important form of all, something Plato calls the form of the good. So we imagine this pyramid. This is a model of reality. Plato has the form of the good on top. There's only one thing on top, and it becomes more and more as you go down. At the very base level, you have reality itself. So a couple things that occur to me here, especially when he says that that at the very top of the pyramid we have one form, right? And as we move down, we have more. We go from the many to the few. So what this brings to my mind here is this classic philosophical question that you see all over the world. It's the idea of the many and the one. There's a paradox about the many and the one. So how do you get many from oneness? Now there's a logical reason for starting here. The idea here is that that things in nature multiply, things in nature divide, things in nature reproduce. So you're going to start with one, and then you're going to end up with two, and then four, and then eight, and on and on and on. This is how reality works. So if we wind back the clock, we have to imagine that things began with a oneness, just like he was talking about earlier when he was describing the laws of physics and the singularity and the Big Bang being one law at that time. Everything rolls back to oneness. It's a logical necessity. So how do you start with one and get the multiplicity of the world? How does that happen? So this is a perennial philosophical problem. It's also important to see that this hierarchy ascends to oneness. So there's something at the top of it that is one. And I have to say again, we have what sounds like a preformation here of the idea of monotheism. It's probably the furthest thing from Plato's mind, even religion probably the furthest thing from his mind necessarily when he's doing this exercise. But in any case, he comes to a logical necessity here, that what is there at the beginning and what is at the top of the hierarchy on which everything depends must be something that is one. Not many, but one. Just as modern religious people insist that God is one. Not many, but one. And again, I want to call out here to the legacy that came before Plato. Brian doesn't touch on, but it's important to bring up. Plato's not the first, even ancient Greek, to do this. So the pre-Socratics, the people that came before Socrates, Plato's teacher. This goes back to probably like 700-800 BC, all the way up to 400 BC, the time of Plato. These pre-Socratics, people like Heraclitus and Pythagoras and Parmenides and some of these people, they all suggested that this oneness, this idea of oneness in the beginning as the source and origin of things, they played around with this idea for hundreds of years. They called it the monad. They also have an ancient myth in Greece, the Pelasgian creation myth, which is something that comes even before Homer. And in that myth, they talk about the world and the gods springing from a divine unity. They call this unity Euronome. She's essentially the great goddess that becomes all that exists. A oneness at the beginning. You see the point. He says, Plato believed that to exist is fundamentally good. Existence is good, right? It reminds me of the Bible when God creates things and says, and it was good, right? Plato believed that to exist was good. And underlying all of existence then is the form that is pure goodness itself, right? This is what Plato puts at the top, and he calls the form of the good. Brian says it is the form of the good that stands behind all things, both physical and non-physical, giving them existence as well as intelligibility, right? So I can't even encounter a thing unless it's intelligible, unless it can be comprehended. That's what forms are for. But then there's the existence itself. It's the actualizing of those forms, the taking the form of a dog and making an actual dog exist. Both of these things, right? Existence and intelligibility, the physical and the non-physical. Both of these things is encapsulated in what Plato calls the form of the good. And I want you to see the paradox in this, right? When we're talking about the form of the good, we're talking about the thing there in the beginning, the source and origin. We're talking about the thing, an idea, very, very close to a monotheistic idea of God already. We're just calling it the form of the good. So we should be seeing paradox. We should be seeing echoes of the Ouroboros, and we are, right? This is the source of the physical and the non-physical. How can that be? Aren't those opposites? So we're seeing the Ouroboros, we're seeing this mythological motif, the same one we see in, the ancient Greek creation story that follows that Euronome story. This is the Hesiod story where the beginning is heaven and earth, right? So you have this oneness in the Euronome myth, and in the myth of Hesiod about the creation of the world, this ancient Greek myth that comes later. You have this monad split into two, heaven and earth, Ornos and Gaia. Okay, so this is what we see in Plato's form of the good, the source of the physical and the non-physical. Brian goes on, he says, that which imparts the power of knowing to the knower is the idea of the good. Hair stands up on my arm. That which imparts the power of knowing to the knower. So this reminds me of a quote by that medieval theologian. Now his name's not going to come to me. Meister Eckhart. You got to remember when we talked about Eckhart, and Eckhart said, the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. Right? And what Brian's saying here, and sort of from as a mouthpiece of Plato, is the form of the good is that which imparts the power of knowing to the knower. So there's something in common here between the power of knowing and the knower. And this is the idea of the good. Okay, so there's a connection between God and consciousness or mind, right? The knower, that's mind. And the ancient Greeks had all sorts of interesting ideas to talk about mind. They used the word nous and logos as an example, which are words you've probably heard before, at least logos if you're a Christian, that gets adopted into Christian ideology. And we saw that earlier. We saw this insistence that there's a connection between reason and this idea of the non-physical component of reality or mind. Now we're seeing the same thing here with forms, not just forms, but with the highest form, the form of the good, with God itself. There's a connection between God and mind. And mind is a mystery, like God is a mystery. This non-physical thing that really composes all that matters to us. Our experience, our thinking, our judgment, our values, mind. And none of it is physical. We can't even tell you from a scientific perspective what mind is. It's a mystery, just like God is a mystery. So you're seeing these ideas coming closer together. All right, he goes on, he says, the form of the good as being or existence itself, right? Imagine the form of the good as being or existence itself is both eternal and transcendent. So the form of the good is both eternal and transcendent. These are both ideas that we would easily give to the notion of God, eternal and transcendent. It has always been and will always be timeless and unchanging. It is the ultimate reality. Because it is unchanging, it has always existed. It needs nothing else in order to exist. All right, so this is the way Plato describes how what the form of the good must be, strictly through logic. When it says it's eternal and transcendent, it's talking about the fact that nothing exists, nothing can exist, nothing can be actualized without the forms upon which it's based. And those forms seem to come from nowhere. They seem to be eternal. They seem you can't get rid of them and you can't create them. They seem to be eternal. And they are transcendent because they're not physically present. They matter integrally to what's physically real, but I can't put my hands on them. I can't put my eyes on them. They're transcendent and eternal, aren't they? Because they're eternal, they must have always been and will always be. Okay, timeless and unchanging. For something to be eternal, it must be outside of time, right? If it exists forever, it must be outside of time. And if it exists forever in the same form, it must be unchanging. You see what I'm saying? This is sheer logic. No religious language at all. And he says it's the ultimate reality. What must be, right? Because the forms themselves are necessary for things to be actualized in the world. Yeah, they're based on a pattern. That form is a prerequisite. It must exist. It's the thing on which real things are based. And the form of the good is the thing on which all the other forms are based. That's how it's ultimate reality. It goes no deeper. And it must. This is a necessity, a logical necessity. It says it needs nothing else in order to exist, right? It wasn't created. It's always been, right? And all of these ideas start to come together. God is the uncreated, the eternal, the transcendent, the timeless, the unchanging. All of these things we would easily attribute to this idea of God. And Plato is getting there talking about the source of forms from sheer logic. Now, something that is sufficient to itself, that's contingent upon nothing, is a preformation of Aristotle's idea of a first cause, as well as this idea of a monotheistic God. We'll get to Aristotle shortly, but a couple more. He says the form of the good is then the necessary being. Nothing can exist apart from it, and we rely on its existence for our existence. The form of the good shares its being with all other forms by giving of itself to them, the one that unites the many. The form of the good, or let's just call it God, is the one that unites the many. The thing that shares its being with all other things, giving them being. So your being and my being is contingent upon being itself. That's what Plato is saying God is. And lastly, for Plato, he says, in the form of the good, we find unique, godlike qualities emerging from within Greek philosophical thought. The good is perfect and unchanging, just as God is perfect and unchanging. The good is the necessary existence where all things find their own existence. Another quality we discover in the God of monotheism. You see his point. All right, that brings me to Aristotle. As you know, Socrates was the master of Plato, and Plato was the master of Aristotle. So we're just kind of going down the line. Aristotle, if you don't know, is largely considered to be sort of the father of science. He's the first empiricist. He's somebody who questioned Plato's mystical side and became, as a consequence, maybe the best known philosopher and the best known, proto-scientist of all time. And Aristotle said this. Brian introduces Aristotle like this. For Aristotle, the forms do exist, but only within real things and not apart on their own, floating around in some ideal realm. See what I mean? Aristotle pulls back from some of the mysticism. He's like, I agree that forms are necessary. I just have no reason to think they're in some realm outside of this one. He says Aristotle taught within the plant, within the horse, and within the human being is where you will find the world of matter and Plato's world of forms combined. So form and matter comes together in actuality, basically is what he's saying. That doesn't answer to me where matter or form comes from. And I think that's kind of the gap in Aristotle's logic here, but we'll push on. He says one of Aristotle's main curiosities in life was the question of why things undergo change. Why is there any movement or change at all in the world? And what could have started all this movement and change in the universe in the first place? So you look around, you see the stars are moving, the planets are moving, beings are moving of all kinds, plants, animals, and so forth. There's action and interaction, there's cause and effect. Everything that happens, all the action in the world is motion and change. And Aristotle's saying, well, why is it necessary? Where does it come from? What does it mean? And that brings him to this idea of infinite regression, which you may have heard about. And Brian discusses it like this. He says, you cannot have an infinitely long line of dominoes without something there to push over the first one, because everything depends on something else to bring it into being or set it into motion. Change cannot go back indefinitely without something that's unchanging there to start it out. A first cause. Okay, so this is Aristotle's great contribution, strictly through logic. He's saying, something like Newton would say earlier. He's saying, Newton says, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, and nothing happens without a cause. So we see in the laws of motion later a reformation of what you just heard from Aristotle. We can't go back indefinitely. There must be something to push the first domino, or there's no motion possible. There's no change possible. There must be a first mover. There must be a first cause. And so we arrive at an idea very like God, or very like a creator, using logic only. Brian says, Aristotle introduces the unmoved mover, a divine being who transcends the physical world while still maintaining an effect on it. Aristotle describes his unmoved mover as immutable, meaning it does not undergo change. Since Aristotle believed time is a measure of change, he argued that the unmoved mover must necessarily exist outside of time. So Plato sort of made that same argument before, this idea of being outside of time, because forms don't change. They're a constant, you might say. And so Aristotle says the same thing. Whatever the unmoved mover is, it cannot be subject to change because it must be outside of time. It must be outside of time because it seems to be the cause of time. And so it has to be outside of time and therefore outside of change and therefore eternal and unchanging. Okay, so this is really reinforcing what we heard from Plato already. So an unmoved mover must be outside of time and change. It must be transcendent as well as immanent. So you see the paradox there that we saw from Plato. It has to be transcendent, outside of time and space, but also immanent, right? It is responsible for not only the existence of the world, but all of the motion and change and action taking place, right? It's the first domino pusher. And this is an idea that will be leveraged in Judaism. Even this idea, this paradoxical idea of the unmoved mover being transcendent and immanent. We have in Judaism God described as the first and the last. So you see the same kind of opposites trying to be, jammed together there. And in Christianity, we have Jesus described as being both God and man. So you see this repetition of this paradoxical notion of the union of opposites, the Ouroboros. And we always see this when we start exploring ontology. And it doesn't matter whether we're looking at the East or the West, whether we're looking at the ancient writers or the medieval writers or the modern ones, we always encounter this idea of paradox when we're journeying down this path of ontology, looking at origins, looking at these deepest questions. Brian says, the unmoved mover is the necessary existent, required to explain all change in the universe. Without this being, no motion would be possible. Aristotle's mover does not do things like speak, move around, or intervene in human history, as these would all require movement, motion. The unmoved mover has always just been there. Right? It's the necessary existent. It's existence itself. So he's pointing this out just to say that modern religious ideas of God are very, very close to this idea of the unmoved mover that we've already talked about. But Aristotle, who's coining this idea, is not talking about this idea in the way that we would talk about God being personal, in a way that religious people would talk about God providing revelation to people, or letting them, sending them divine messages or whatever. Like, there is no interaction here between the unmoved mover and reality itself. It's simply the foundation for reality. So there is something a little bit different here than we would say in like modern Christianity or whatever, trying to reconcile the idea of the unmoved mover to a monotheistic God. But that's not to say this idea is not present in religious thought kind of all over the world. So this idea of the unmoved mover being, or God being, the basis of reality, that which is required for anything to exist or any action to take place. So I guess I'll leave it there. That's being recognized as existing, but also recognizing as not directly engaging or involving itself in the created world. This idea is an ancient one. There's a word for it in Latin called Deus abscondus, the God that creates and then disappears. It's a similar idea to the philosophy called pandeism, where the universe is considered to be identical to God. And apart from the laws of physics, there's no intervention at all. But even in more modern religious ideas, there's this idea of the demiurge, which is the creator God that many groups, both Greek, Egyptian, and from the Middle East, and from Syria, Palestine, Israel, a whole bunch of tribes in these areas had similar ideas about a God that was behind the creator, like the real God behind this demiurge who does all the creating. And so that God doesn't do anything. It creates the creator and then it just steps away. Okay, this is something like what Aristotle's getting at with his idea of the unmoved mover. Not exactly a personal God, a God that creates and steps away. Is not actively involved in the world. All right, then he gets to what I thought was my absolute favorite bit of the whole book. Is this bit he's talking about Aristotle and this idea of the unmoved mover, and he says this. So what is this mover doing? If it exists in the world of pure rational thought, Aristotle deduced that the unmoved mover is perfect and must therefore be engaged in the highest rational activity, contemplation. There is nothing better, perhaps there's nothing other, than the unmoved mover for it to think about. Aristotle ultimately concludes that the unmoved mover must be engaged in self-contemplation. In other words, the unmoved mover is thought, thinking about itself. Right, this comes from Book 12, Part 9 of Aristotle's Metaphysics. It doesn't come out of nowhere, this idea of connecting God and mind. Again, we saw hints of that already when we were talking about Plato. In the pre-Socratic world, so before the time of Plato, we have a couple of things that we've discussed before, but there's a quote from Pindar, this is 470 BC, where Pindar says, all things spring from the mind of Zeus. And just before that, we have a pre-Socratic philosopher named Anaxagoras who says, all things that are now or will be, nous arranged them all, mind arranged them all. And then I'll just tack on here that in the New World, the Lakota tribe has a creation story that begins by saying, in the beginning, all things came from the mind of Okonde, the mind of God. Exactly what Pindar said, all things spring from the mind of Zeus. So we have this idea of an unmoved mover who's associated with mind, and of course it is. Mind is that thing that is ever present. It's the thing that seems to be eternal. It is the thing that is non-physical. It is the most important component of reality, and it's non-physical. So of course, all of these things line up with this notion of God that we've developed. Now I'm going to read you, this is the actual quote from Aristotle's Metaphysics, so you get your head wrapped around his words. And they're not as eloquent as Brian's, but I just mean they're more difficult. It's a more difficult read, so let me give it to you. Aristotle says, whether its substance is the faculty of thought or the act of thinking, what does it think of? Either of itself or of something else. Evidently, it thinks of that which is most divine and precious, and it does not change. Therefore, it must be of itself that the divine thought thinks. And its thinking is a thinking on thinking. That's what Brian was saying when he was talking about God being engaged in self-contemplation, right? Its thinking is a thinking on thinking. This is consciousness observing itself, right? This is kind of an image of feedback that I'm trying to create for you. And you've heard me talk about this before. And this is why I find this so stunning. I always sort of wrote Aristotle off as too much working to counteract Plato's mysticism. Like he's overcompensating for Plato's mysticism, and in doing so, he's being way too scientific, way too focused on the physical reality, and not open-minded enough to the larger reality. And so I didn't really read Aristotle as much as I did Plato. So I was surprised to see this. What he's saying is what the unmoved mover is doing, what God is doing, necessarily is contemplating itself. That God is contemplation, and what it's contemplating is itself. You have this self-experience being demonstrated, and it should remind you of something that I say a lot on the podcast. We are the experience God is having. Now, I did have a mystical experience of my own that brought me to this conclusion, and I'll do my best to kind of lay it out so you can see why this is so striking to me, why I was so surprised to see Aristotle saying something that I said after I had a mystical experience, the most mystical shit I've ever thought before in my life. And that is that the reality of existence is that everything is one. And what that oneness is consciousness. So this is what the hippies say when they say, I was one with the universe. This sort of a feeling is what I had. And the impression it made on me is all things are one, and that oneness is consciousness. Something like that. So here's the idea. If God is this oneness, God is consciousness itself, what is it that God is doing? What is it possible for God to do? If God is one, there is nothing else. There's nothing for it to interact with. There's nothing for it to push or pull or move. It's just God there. God is one. So whatever God's doing, he's doing it with itself. And if God is consciousness, clearly, what does consciousness do? It experiences. So God is that which experiences, experiencing itself. And you have an image here of self-contemplation or self-experience. You have a picture of God staring at himself in the mirror, for lack of a better visual for you. And what this, so you can see how this is exactly what Aristotle has said. Whatever God is, it must be contemplation, contemplating itself. And what my mystical experience said is, whatever God is, it's consciousness experiencing itself. Now, what's disappointing to me is that Aristotle doesn't connect God's self-contemplation or self-experience to being itself, even though he calls God pure act, as though God is a verb. God is doing something. Whatever God is, it's an act. He says that. He tells you what the act must be. It must be a process of self-contemplation. But what he doesn't do is suggest what is God's self-contemplation. What does it do when God thinks about itself? When God experiences itself? What is the point of it? And my mystical experience told me, look, the cosmos, everything that you experience, consciousness and everything in consciousness, and that's the world and everything else. All of this is the consequence of God's self-contemplation. God experiences itself, and the result is being. The result is you and me and time and space and all of this. And Aristotle didn't make that last leap. And I don't know. I point to him and say, you weren't mystical enough. You could have taken that last little. It's not even a big step, man. It's a tiny little step past where he's gone. All right, so that brings us to the section of the book in the middle where he's talking about how these ancient philosophical ideas begin to bleed into our modern religious ones. So I'm going to call this section Synthesis, Athens Meets Jerusalem. So he starts talking about other characters. We did Plato, we did Aristotle. Now he's talking about Philo of Alexandria. Obviously, Alexandria was a Greek city in Egypt, established by Alexander the Great. It was the place where the Library of Alexandria was, the very first university. It was a place of learning, and Philo was one of these people there, learning and benefiting from, being in the hub of knowledge for the world at the time. Philo also happened to be a Jew, and so there's the beginnings of this synthesis starting to happen, and Philo is a great representation of that. Brian says, a major contribution of Philo was his theological development of the Greek term logos. Philo replaced Plato's form of the good with Yahweh, the Jewish God. Philo proclaimed that the unseen world of forms does indeed exist as the ideas of created things within the mind of God. So the forms Plato talked about, and the non-physical and all these connections to mind, and even Aristotle connecting the unmoved mover to mind, now we start merging these things together. The forms exist in the mind of God, right? So Aristotle said there must be a God. Plato said there must be a God. They just call it different things, unmoved mover or the form of the good. And Philo is plugging it in, like plug and play with the Hebrew Old Testament. And it gives him a way of understanding how maybe a Jewish understanding of divine things or spiritual things just sort of provide analogies to the philosophical idea of forms. And Yahweh is going to plug right into this idea of the unmoved mover or the form of the good. He goes on, he says, in the form of the good and the unmoved mover, Greek philosophy gave Judaism the rational means to explain why God must necessarily exist outside of both time and change, therefore being eternal in nature. Right? So it's not to say that the Jews didn't have those ideas, because they did, but they came from revelation. Right? So if you're one of those skeptical people that won't accept the revelation, Fair enough. It wasn't you that got the revelation. You're not going to take his word for it, but you don't need it. Right now, you can look at what the revelation the Jews received from Moses and from God and so forth. You can take that and you can see the parallels that the ancient Greeks arrived at through reason alone. And now you can plug them right in together. And you have this embrace of, philosophic, rational thought and religious thought. And that continues with Thomas Aquinas. And Brian says about him, Aquinas took Aristotle's essence existence discussion to a higher level. He derived that only within God does or can essence equal existence. In everything that is not God, there is an essence and a possible existence. So you might say there's a form of a dog, that's the essence, and in that form represents the possibility for an actual dog. Okay, but he says, for God, however, what he is, his essence, is equal to what it means that he exists. So for God, his essence is existence. God's essence is existence. He is being itself. That's what Brian says. And you may think this is arbitrary or some kind of circular word game, but philosophers such as Hegel write some of the densest philosophical tomes on the mystery of being, on this exact idea. So Aquinas has taken this ancient Greek idea of a necessary existent, and he's calling that thing existence or being, God. And he's equating those two. God is existence. God is being. God is that which is required for you to have your being. Is that which is required for anything to be. Yeah, that's a way of talking about a creator. Sure enough. He says, Moses encounters Yahweh in a bush. Here God speaks to Moses saying, I am who I am. In this passage, Aquinas recognizes one of the greatest philosophical statements ever made. God revealing he is existence itself. Aquinas would go on to teach that all created things find their existence as a sharing in the existence of God. All things exist by participating in the primary existence of God, who is within all things, holding them in existence at every moment. Right? So we talked about God being a verb or being pure act earlier. And what that act is doing is maintaining being. It's not like, this is a slightly different angle than maybe the biblical one. It's not saying that God creates and creation is permanent. It's God creates and continues to create. Like what God is this process of maintaining reality. The Hindus have a great way of thinking about this because they see God as both creator, destroyer, and preserver. God is Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, all in one. Now the preserver part, that's what I'm getting at here. God's existence is constantly maintaining this thing that we call reality. We can understand that if we understand God as mind, and we all consider ourselves to be mind. So there's a connection between God and ourselves that's deeper than we like to admit. And the question might be, if God stops thinking, if God takes a nap or something, does all of this disappear? The Hindus have a great way of talking about that as well, about Brahma sleeping and waking, and the universe being created and destroyed in waves as a consequence. And some beautiful imagery there as well. All right, now he says there are 5 divine attributes from Aquinas we will use as our rational description of God. God is non-physical, one, infinite, eternal, and unknowable. Okay, so I might actually substitute omnipotent in place of eternal or infinite, because I kind of feel like eternal and infinite share. There's a fine line between them, and I'm not sure I can make a great distinction between them. But fair enough. I think these are, from all of the logic and reason that we've gone through so far, we would have to suggest that if there is a form of the good, if there is a first cause or an unmoved mover, that it must necessarily be all of these things. Non-physical, one, infinite, eternal, and unknowable. Brian says, how does our modern understanding of the universe reveal God as non-physical, one, infinite, eternal, and unknowable? And this is where we're going to turn to modern science, okay? And I'm going to break this up into small sections. I'm going to call this first one the universe in God's image. So think about this. As I'm reading this, we understand God to be non-physical, to be one, infinite, eternal, and unknowable. And now what I'm going to do here is describe the universe and how it accords to this image of God. All right, so we're going to start with oneness. Brian says God is one. One place we see such a unity is in the first moment of the Big Bang. The universe was indivisible and undifferentiated. All matter was energy, and all forces were combined into one. Ultimately simple and perfectly one, just as the universe was at the beginning of time. In this way, the universe bears the Creator's image. So that's the universe as one. How about as infinite or eternal? Brian says, the void of space continues its expansion, impossible to measure. It is in the enormity of the universe that we see God's infinity, revealing itself in the physical world. It seems as though the universe was designed to imitate its creator, both at its indivisible beginning and at its infinite end. God's image is mirrored in the universe. Okay, so the universe is infinite. How about as unknowable? Brian says, what came before the Big Bang? We don't know if there was anything before the Big Bang. We most likely never will. God's attribute of unknowability lies again in the very first moment of the universe, the ultimate singularity in science. Our knowledge gets us very close to the beginning, but the whole of the truth is veiled from our eyes, and so it is with God. His true essence remains hidden from our minds, just as the first moment of the universe remains hidden from our science. So the universe is unknowable. Now, Brian also speaks to the fact that the universe is expanding faster than the speed of light can travel, so there will always be a boundary beyond which our knowledge cannot reach. Again, the universe is unknowable as God is unknowable. Let's do the same thing with life. This is another one of the mysteries of science. How do we get life from non-life? So let's do the same exercise we've done it with the universe, let's do it with life. I'm going to call this life in God's image. Remember, God is one. So let's start there. Brian says, modern science holds that all living things are related to one another. Organic life likely started from one common origin point. Darwin wrote, quote, I should infer from analogy that probably all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from some single primordial form into which life was first breathed, unquote. Brian says, if the first moment of the Big Bang displayed oneness for the universe, then Luca, the last universal common ancestor, similarly displayed unity for all of life. Luca were single-celled organisms. The single-celled ancestors of life was, like God, indivisible. In this way, God shows his oneness in the beginning of life. So all life rolls back to one source. That source was single-celled, which means it's indivisible. All that lines up, right? God is one. Life as one. How about as infinite or eternal? Brian says, after God's oneness, we note how life displays the attributes of God's infinity. Like the edges of the universe forever chasing infinite size, life possesses a similar quality in its near infinite potential to evolve and change in endless ways. The more diverse life becomes, the more it represents the infinity of God. Right? Life just keeps going on, changing forever. And then how about unknowable? Is life unknowable the way God is unknowable? Brian says, to date, we are still unable to create life in a lab. The creation of a living thing from a non-living things remains a mystery to us, just as God's own essence remains a mystery. Fair enough. Got one more. How about mind? This is another consciousness is another mystery of science, unsolved mystery of science. Where does it come from? How does it exist? Why does it exist? We don't know. So I'm going to call this one mind in God's image. And again, we'll start with oneness. Is mind one the way that God is one? He says the human mind at rest may be the closest analogy of God's oneness in the entire universe. There are no divisions in the resting mind. Nothing to separate out from something else, just a near infinite capacity to think of whatever we put in it. In many ways, the resting mind resembles the first moment of the Big Bang and the first cells of life. All three are simple and indivisible. All three are unities containing endless potential to become. So the resting mind, mind with no thought, unifies all possible thoughts. It's the potential for any possible thought. So it reflects oneness in the same way God is one. We might also say that if you are resting your mind with no thought, and I'm resting mine, and everyone else in the world is resting theirs, and there's no thought, then all of our consciousness is united. It is the same experience. You know what I mean? How about the infinite or eternal component? Brian says, every time we begin a new thought process, we venture out towards an infinite diversity of thoughts. Whether we're analyzing empirical data and drawing interpretive conclusions, or imagining entire worlds in fictional works, the mind's bounds seem limitless. Great ideas passed down from generation to generation grow and develop within the minds of humanity long after their originators have passed on. The ideas live for centuries. In this way, the mind at work resembles the infinity of God. So the mind at rest resembles the oneness. The mind at work represents the infinity. How about the unknowable quality? Brian says, with the arrival of humans, it has been said, the universe has suddenly become conscious of itself. This truly is the greatest mystery of all. There have been countless studies conducted on psychology and neuroscience, but we have yet to crack the code on how the mind works. Consciousness is still one of the greatest mysteries of all. There is an unknowability to the mind exceeding almost everything else in the universe. It is one while at rest, infinite while at work, eternal in what it knows, and unknowable, just as the divine is the ultimate unknowable mystery. And listen to the paradox in this. Listen to the Ouroboros just echoing in this. It is one while at rest, infinite while at work, eternal in what it knows, and also unknowable. You see what I mean? The hair stands up on my arms. That brings me to my conclusion. So what do you think? Did you know this philosophic pedigree stood behind our modern religious ideas? Does this make you think differently about writing off religious ideas as superstition or as unscientific? Does it make you feel differently about the roots of monotheism? Well, it should. Here we have laid bare the survivors in the battle of reason, which raged uniquely in the Western mind for thousands of years. After countless observation, endless public debate, and generation after generation of philosophic development, we arrived at the unquestionable conclusion of a transcendent reality upon which the physical world depends, something which is the basis for being, the fundamental existent, something they didn't quite have a word for. Plato called it the good, and we moderns followed suit, merely dropping one of the O's. The good becomes God with a capital G. If you're holding on to your skepticism at this point, I suppose I understand. These are the biggest questions after all, and a healthy dose of skepticism is probably in order. If merely following the logic here doesn't raise revelation to a position to be taken seriously, perhaps we can back into this problem and see what happens. If we simply observe the world around us and the world within us, and see if it matches the predictions of the ancient Greek formula, Oh, testing predictions against experiment. Isn't that the scientific method? Well then, if we take Aristotle seriously and believe in a transcendent first cause existing outside of time, whose existence undergirds all of existence, what would we expect to find? If God's existence is where my existence comes from, I'd expect my being to reflect God's being. If the cosmos is the same, I'd expect it too will reflect God's being. So let's put this to the test. Is this what we find? Indeed we do, just as Brian laid out. We see the primary qualities of this necessary existent of God reflected in ourselves and in the cosmos equally. We see the so-called image of God. Just as God is eternal, we find life, consciousness, and the expanding universe eternal. Just as God is one, we find a single origin for life and for the cosmos and the singularity of the Big Bang. And just as God is unknowable, we find no scientifically rigorous way of discovering how the cosmos came to be, how life came to be, or even how consciousness can exist at all. So there you have it. Whether we start from first principles or back into them from observation, we cannot deny that there is truth to be discovered here. And if you're not one to accept religious revelation, this is good news. You don't have to. As it turns out, logic and reason will take you to the same conclusion, if only you let it.